This video contains descriptions of disturbing scenarios that some viewers may find distressing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and this episode is a redo of our second episode of the Crystal McCrory Jones case. After I had initially made the second video, I received a lot of information that contradicted what I had supplied. I never want to put out incorrect information, so I'm backing up and starting again. I've made an introduction video to the case, and there's a link to it in the description. As a brief recap, Crystal was found at her home on February 9, 2023, deceased from a gunshot wound to the head. Her death was almost immediately ruled a suicide by the West Carrol Parish Sheriff's Department in Oak Grove, Louisiana. Numerous discrepancies and errors became known soon after Crystal's death, but the Sheriff's Office has refused to perform a thorough or even slightly thorough investigation. In this video, we're going to be listening to the interview that Crystal's husband, Tony, had with Chief Deputy Allen Irby, and we'll be looking at the investigative report that Irby wrote. On the evening of Crystal's death, Tony went to the Sheriff's Department for an interview. The interview started at 6:45, which was only 2 hours and 4 minutes since the Sheriff's Department had notified him of her death. Let's listen.
This is Allen Irby, Chief Deputy with the West Carrol Sheriff's Office. Today's date, February the 9th, 2023. The time is 18:45 hours. This is Allen Irby, Chief Deputy with the West Carrol Sheriff's Office. Today's date, February the 9th, 2023. The time is 18:45 hours. The place is West Carrol Parish CID. I'll be taking a statement this afternoon from Tony Jones. Tony's a white male, gives his date of birth and resides at a residence located at I'll be taking the statement from Tony in reference to a self-inflicted gunshot wound of his wife, Miss Crystal McCrory Jones. Her date of birth is Tony and Crystal were married for 5 years and lived together in Oak Grove. Tony, would you state your name and date of birth for the recording, please?
Tony Joe Jones.
Tony, we responded to your residence this afternoon, the West Carrol Sheriff's Office investigators and deputies in reference to your wife, Miss Crystal, and a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Could you walk me through your and her activities of today, starting from when you left your residence this morning?
I left the residence shortly after 8 o'clock. I went to Bastrop to a customer's house, Darren, in Bastrop. Worked on stuff for him, and I left there, and it was shortly before 10 o'clock or so. I called Crystal at 10:06, and she answered the phone, and I was like, "What are you doing?" And I stayed on the phone with her for 15 or 20 minutes, I say. And I had another job to do in Forest High School. So I went into town. I put a check in the bank. I turned around, and then I went to eat at Bakery Barn. I left there and went to Forest High School, and I was there till just shy of 3 o'clock. I got my daughter checked her out from school since I was already there at like 2:45, and I drove and I sent her a message saying, "Hey, I got little girl," and she didn't respond, which she normally does. Then I drove into town, and me and my daughter got something to eat at Sonic, and I tried to call her again, and she didn't answer. So then I contacted the East Carroll Medical Clinic because she had an appointment at 2:30, and I said, and this was like 3:45 or something, and I asked them, I said, my wife was supposed to have an appointment. Is she still there? And I gave them her name, and she's like, well, she never checked in. And So then I tried to call a couple more times, and I was real worried at that point. So I called Deputy Harris, who was my neighbor, and he said he was almost home, that he would go check. So he got there, and he said that no one was answering the door. Her vehicle was there. I was like, well, please go inside. The door is unlocked. He went inside, was calling her name. I said, the bedroom's in the very back of the house. And her name's Crystal. And so he's calling Crystal. And
Were you still on the phone?
I was still on the phone with him. Okay. And he opened the door and he said, Crystal. And then he, at that point, he said, Tony, I'm sorry to tell you that she is deceased. And so then I rushed home.
Where were you
I was
that
at
time?
the bowling alley, or by our karate school.
Okay.
I was at the karate school, and because we had class tonight, and so I was there waiting for her to get there, and she wasn't there by 4:00. Then that's when I really started panicking, because she had been dealing with some depression, and like I said, that's what she was going to the doctor for.
That was her
appointment to go for the depression. She was on Abilify, and Amy Hale took her off of it, which is her doctor, and so now. And she was trying to come on. She said, I don't feel well. And I told her to call this morning. She set the appointment this morning. And so.
So she made the appointment for 2:30 this morning. Okay. When you talked to her on the phone at 10, how did she sound?
It took her a couple rings to actually get it. And I was like, she's like, hey. And I was like, hey. I said, what you doing? She's like, I was in the living room. And I was like, oh, okay. I was like, sounded like you were asleep. And she's like, no, I wasn't asleep. I was just in the living room. So, and I talked to her. We sat on the phone for a few minutes, and she really wasn't saying anything. Because I talk to her while I drive a lot. And I talk to her while she's driving. And I was like, all right, well, I said, I'm going to get off here. You can get back to what you were doing. And she's like, okay. And I was like, I love you. And she said, I love you. And that's the last time I talked to her.
What handguns were available to her in the bedroom?
I don't know if in her purse there was a 9mm. I don't know if that's the one she used, but there was also a .45 on the nightstand. And that's the gun case was locked because I lost the key. So it was either the 9mm or the .45.
Okay.
Was available.
It was, I think, ECS.
Yeah, it's the one, that was the one she had. Yeah.
Frame. So that gun belonged to her.
Yes. Well, it was in my name, but that was the one she carried for protection.
Okay. And I talked to Deputy Crimes called while we were working the scene, and he told me that he had talked to you there at the karate school this afternoon. Did you see him at the high school?
Yeah, I was at the high school when I talked to him.
Okay. What do you do for a living?
I'm a maintenance handyman, AC repair, pretty much anything.
Okay.
I do a lot of work. I do all the air conditioning and refrigeration for the school system.
Okay. Was Crystal right or left-handed?
She was right-handed.
Okay. All right. I believe that is all the information that I'm going to require from you, Tony. Is there anything that you would like to add or take away from the statement you've given me this evening?
I don't believe so.
Okay. In that case, we'll end this statement. The time now is 18:52 hours.
That interview was only 7 minutes long. And if you're thinking that 7 minutes is way too short for an interview about someone's death, you're absolutely right. Way to go, Allen Irby. Now we know why you got picked to be Chief Deputy. Let's pick this interview apart, starting with problem number 1. Irby starts the interview by saying that Crystal's death was self-inflicted. I would love to hear what kind of investigation was conducted that had them come to that conclusion so quickly. They hadn't even interviewed the spouse yet, and the spouse is always the number 1 suspect. There was no testing that had happened at this point, and I'm pretty sure the correct way to conduct an investigation is not to make any conclusion in the case until after the coroner's report or after the completion of the autopsy, if there is one. Problem number 2. Tony stated that he left the house a little after 8 that morning. In the investigative report filed by Irby, he wrote that he interviewed the person that Tony was working for that morning. We'll call that person Mr. B. In the investigative report, Mr. B stated that Tony had called him around 8 and told him he was on his way. But when a private investigator hired by Crystal's family interviewed Mr. B, he said that wasn't correct and he had actually called Tony because Tony was running late. Crystal's sister Jana was able to obtain Crystal's computer. Through that, Tony's location was able to be accessed via Google Timeline. I wasn't familiar with how Google Timeline worked, but it basically tracks your phone's movements using GPS and provides the information to you through your Google account. I have also discovered that the timeline isn't necessarily always accurate. If the GPS signal isn't strong where your phone is, there can be discrepancies. The Google location data showed that Tony left his house at 8:06 in the morning and arrived at Mr. B's house at 8:54. So it took him 48 minutes to get there when it should have only taken him 31 minutes. Problem number 3. How was Tony so specific as to the time he called Crystal? He said he called her at 10:06. That is just super weird. It's the only instance during the entire interview where he is that exact with the time. It makes me think he had checked his phone prior to the interview to see what time he called her, and that makes me think he had practiced what he was going to tell Deputy Dinky about that day. Problem number 4. Tony stated that he went to the bank to deposit a check. The Google location data showed that he went to the sheriff's department in Oak Grove after he left Mr. B's, and he arrived there at 10:53. The bank that Tony went to is across the street from the sheriff's office, though. The deposit slip he provided as evidence was time-stamped 10:51. So Google Timeline shows him arriving at the sheriff's office 2 minutes later. This discrepancy might just be a Google glitch. Problem number 5. Tony said, "I put a check in the bank, I turned around." And he cuts off the word around like he realized he said something he shouldn't have and stopped before he got the entire sentence out. He then says he ate at the bakery barn. Again, the investigative report differs from Tony's statement. According to the report, Tony got a haircut before he went to the bakery barn, but Tony never said anything about a haircut in his interview with Irby. There was also nothing mentioned about them having proof that Tony had actually been to get a haircut or that he was at the bakery barn that day. Google Timeline does show his phone being at the bakery barn from 11:11 to 11:53. So he had 2 minutes between the sheriff's office and the bakery barn to get a haircut. Even if the barber was riding in the car with him and cutting his hair while they were driving, he still wouldn't have had enough time for a haircut. Problem number 6. Tony stated that he checked his daughter out of school around 2:45. According to Crystal's sister, Tony's daughter always rode the bus home. It seems rather fortuitous that this exact day was the one day that Tony picked her up from school. He stated that after checking his daughter out of school, they went to Sonic to eat. According to Google Timeline, he left the school at 2:43, drove for 20 minutes, went to an unknown location in Oak Grove from 3:03 to 3:10, drove another 15 minutes and got to Sonic at 3:25. Was the GPS signal just not strong enough to get an accurate reading? Because in the 15-minute drive, he only went 1.5 miles. That would put him going 6 miles an hour. Problem number 7. Tony said that after leaving Sonic, he and his daughter went across the street to the martial arts studio, and that when Crystal hadn't made it by 4, he started panicking. But Google Timeline showed that he didn't go to the studio. He went to Walmart, which is over a mile from the studio, and he stayed there until 4:11. Why lie about being at the studio instead of Walmart? I know that sometimes it might feel like it, but going to Walmart really isn't a crime. Then he left Walmart, drove for 5 minutes, and was at an unknown location until 4:37. Problem number 8. Tony said he called Crystal's doctor's office at around 3:45. However, there was a Google search from his phone for the number of the doctor's office at 4:16. If he didn't search for the phone number until 4:16, how could he have called at 3:45? How was he able to be so precise as to when he called Crystal that morning, but then be off 31 minutes about the phone call to the clinic. Problem number 9. Tony waited until 4:23 to call Deputy Harris to perform a wellness check. Tony had all afternoon to go check on Crystal, but he didn't. Instead, he slogged around Oak Grove at a snail's pace, wasting time. And during that stellar interview, did Chief Deputy Dingleberry ask Tony why he didn't go check on Crystal himself? Of course not, because that would seem too much like an investigation. Problem number 10. According to Tony's statement, he stayed on the phone with Deputy Harris from the time he called him for the wellness check until the time that Harris found Crystal. According to Harris, that's not what happened. Here is the report he wrote. Quote, Tony Jones called my cell phone at 16:23 hours and stated he had been unable to make contact with his wife by cell phone. He asked me my location and if I would drive to his house to see if his wife was home or if her tan Chevy Tahoe was in the drive. I arrived at the residence and located the vehicle. I knocked on the door but got no response. I called Tony again and told him no one answered the door. He then asked me to go inside and check on his wife. He gave me directions to the bedroom located on the south side of the house. I observed his wife in the bed with a gunshot wound to the head area. I called Tony back at 16:41 hours and told him his wife was deceased. I asked him where he was. He stated he was at karate practice in Oak Grove, Louisiana. A short time later, he arrived at the residence. The case was turned over to Deputy Allen Irby. End quote. Tony said he told Harris that the door was unlocked, and while Harris didn't mention that in his report, I think it's obvious the door was unlocked. That might be odd in some places, but I think there are still a lot of people in small towns and rural areas that leave their doors unlocked. But why did Tony tell Harris where the bedroom was? Like he knew that's where Crystal would be. And if Harris called Tony back at 4:41, why did Tony tell him he was at the martial arts studio when the Google timeline shows him driving at 4:37? So let's pretend that he actually was at the studio. Tony told Crystal's brother that he had Harris go check on Crystal because he had a karate studio full of students at the time. If that's the case, were any of those students or their parents questioned as to when Tony was there? Someone should have been able to verify that he was actually at the studio and verify what he told them when he left. There is no information on who he left in charge at the studio that day, and doesn't seem to be any evidence that they were questioned by police. The big kicker is that Tony took his 15-year-old daughter with him back to the house. I would bet that someone at the studio would have been willing to take her home with them, so Tony could get her later and spare her the trauma. What kind of parent does that? Problem number 11. Tony stated that after he learned that Crystal had died, he rushed home. By rushed, he meant that he went exactly the speed limit. No rushing, no hurry, no worry. Problem number 12. Throughout the interview, Tony didn't sound even slightly distraught. Here he is talking about his wife's tragic death that happened earlier that day, and he is just matter of fact. I would say he sounded more nervous than anything. I understand that people grieve differently, but I didn't hear any sadness in his voice. Problem number 13. Tony stated in the interview that he started panicking because he was worried about Crystal's depression, and it was the reason she'd made a doctor's appointment that day. He made it sound like he was worried she was going to commit suicide. If you were so worried about it, why did you leave loaded guns at your house, you brainless twit? Why leave medication there? In fact, if you were so worried about her, why didn't you just stay home that day to make sure she was going to be okay? Problem number 14. When Tony was telling Irby about the phone call he had with Crystal that morning, why did he point out that she said she was in the living room? And here's how that part went. Captain Goofy Pants asked Tony, "Okay, when you talked to her on the phone at 10, how did she sound?" And Tony answered, "It took her a couple of rings to actually get it, and I was like, she was like, hey," and I was like, "Hey." I said, "What are you doing?" She was like, "I was in the living room," and I was like, "Oh, okay." I was like, "It sounded like you were asleep," and she was like, "No, I wasn't asleep. I was just in the living room." Well, let me stop here and say that, Tony is, totally a valley girl, for sure. How many times did he, say the word like? And he didn't answer Irby's question. Irby didn't ask what Crystal said, he asked how she sounded. An accurate response would have been that she sounded like she always did, or she sounded tired, or maybe happy, or even sad. Tony tells him that she told him that she was in the living room and hadn't been asleep. Why point that out? And did Tony actually talk to Crystal then, or was he just talking to her voicemail? So the timeline that Tony gave is different from the timeline in the investigative report, and different than the Google timeline data showed. I can understand a timeline not being perfect, but it should be more accurate than Tony's was. Something else that might figure into the wonky timeline is that Tony has more than one phone. We don't know that he was actually with the phone that was connected to Google Timeline the entire day. That phone could have easily been left somewhere, like maybe a school, and then picked back up. Deputy Dinky gets 0 points for his sorry excuse of an interview. I'd like to say that he gets more points for the report he wrote, but he doesn't. The first page of the investigative report is just information about the report itself, but pay attention to the date of the report, 2/13/2023. That will be important here in a few minutes. I am using an AI voice for the part of Deputy Dinky.
On February 9th, 23, at approximately 16:35 hours, the West Carrol Sheriff's Office received a report of a death by firearm at the address of redacted Oak Grove. This is the residence of Tony and Crystal Jones. I responded to the residence along with Chief Investigator David Voigt, Sheriff Scott Matthews, and Police Chief Louis Bubba Russell. Upon arrival, approximately 16:49, we were met by Deputy Charles Chuck Harris. According to Deputy Harris, Tony Jones had called him by cell phone and asked that to go by the Jones residence to check on his wife. Apparently, Mr. Jones could not reach his wife by cell phone and became concerned when he learned his wife did not make a 2:30 doctor's appointment in Lake Providence. Upon Deputy Harris's arrival, he would locate Mrs. Jones in her and her husband's bed in the master bedroom, suffering from what appeared to be a gunshot wound to the head. Mrs. Jones was deceased. Deputy Harris stated Mr. Jones was at the Jones Karate School in Oak Grove, awaiting his wife's arrival to start their evening class, and Mrs. Jones never arrived at the karate school.
Suffering would indicate she was still alive, you putz. We know that Google Timeline never showed Tony to be at the martial arts studio, but even if he had been, we also know that he wasted a bunch of time that afternoon when he could have been checking on Crystal.
Upon entering the residence, I observed an adult female, dressed in a bathrobe, lying in a normal position in the bed. Items observed on the nightstand would indicate Mrs. Jones would probably normally sleep on that side of the bed, which was the west side. Bed covers were pulled up to just above the waist, and the body was facing the west, lying on the left side. The right band clutched a compact frame 9mm handgun. It was evident when the handgun was discharged, it did not chamber the next round from the magazine. This condition is usually caused by a limp wrist situation, where the shooter fires the weapon with one hand, and the weapon is not stable enough to eject the spent casing and chamber the next round.
I'll be the first to admit that I know little to nothing about guns, but I think it's interesting that the gun was still in her hand, even though the weapon wasn't stable enough to eject the spent casing and chamber the next round. It seems like the gun would have fallen out of her hand if it was that unstable.
Once the coroner was on scene and gathered his information, the body was moved. The projectile appeared to have been fired at point-blank range into the right side of the skull and exited the left side of the skull, penetrating the pillow and the headboard of the bed. After penetrating the headboard, the projectile took a downward trajectory and lodged in the drywall behind the headboard. The projectile was located and removed from the drywall. This would be the south wall of the bedroom. Evidence resulting from the discharge of the weapon would suggest the body remained at rest in the location it was in during the weapon's discharge. The projectile, when discharged, appeared to have entered the right side of the skull, traveled through and exited the left side of the skull. Trajectory of the projectile's final location was consistent with the body and head positioning.
What isn't mentioned in this report, nor any other report that I've seen, is that there was a pillow that was over Crystal's head and had a bullet hole through it. There are pictures of it in the crime scene photos. She had been shot through a pillow, and Dinky doesn't think to mention it in his investigative report. Why not? Is it because when people think about people committing suicide, it usually isn't done through a pillow? But maybe if someone shot Crystal and didn't have the nerve to look at her while they did it, A pillow would come in handy.
Deputy Harris had stated the front door of the residence was unlocked upon his arrival. There was no sign of forced entry or evidence that anyone else had been inside the residence during or after the shooting. There were no signs of a struggle or any other indications of foul play.
Of course, there was no sign of forced entry. The front door was unlocked, you doink. I wonder what evidence would have been necessary to determine that no one else had been inside the residence before or after the shooting. Does Irby expect a shooter to leave a shoe behind like Cinderella?
The family dog was loose inside the home.
Not only was the family dog loose inside the house, the dog was in the crime scene photos. Even worse, there is a photo of the dog on the bed with Crystal. When I saw that photo, I said things that would make my Victorian ancestors develop the vapors. These morons just let the dog run loose through the crime scene.
Investigators searched the west wall and floor of the bedroom for a spent casing and could not locate it. The positioning of the body and manner of the discharge clearly indicated the casing should have been in that area of the room. It was determined that due to the firearm's jammed condition, the spent casing may not have ejected properly and may have stuck to clothing or possibly hair. I decided to make the pathologist aware and see if he could locate the casing during autopsy. The clothed body was wrapped in the bed sheet and then placed into a body bag. When removing the top cover, it should be noted, investigators could feel body beat trapped underneath the covers surrounding the legs. An onset of rigor was noticed, but rigor was not substantially in place. Lividity was present on the back of the legs. The body was removed from the residence by the West Carrol coroner at approximately 1800.
So after explaining that there was probably a limp wrist situation and the casing might not have ejected at all, now it's that it might not have ejected properly.
Upon departure from the residence, I advised Tony Jones he would need to come to the West Carrol CID to be interviewed in reference to the activities of the day. Mr. Jones agreed to meet me. On February 9th, 2023, at approximately 1845 hours, Tony Jones submitted to a recorded statement. One in his statement, Tony Jones would advise he left his residence that morning at approximately 0800 en route to Bastrop, LA, to do electrical work for Mr. B. Mr. B was interviewed on 2/17/2023 and advised Tony called him at approximately 0800 and told him he was on the way and asked him to empty the refrigerator that Mr. B needed repaired. Mr. B stated Tony Jones arrived at his residence about 0845, completed the work, and completed a small electrical job for him. Mr. B stated Tony left his residence between 0945 and 1000.
How can a report be dated 2/13/2023 but have information from 2/17/2023 on it? Is Irby a time traveler?
Tony Jones stated in the recording after leaving Mr. B, he called his wife while driving on his way to Oak Grove. Tony Jones stated, Crystal sounded normal in the conversation, and the call lasted approximately 20 minutes.
Except Tony Jones didn't say that. He talked about what she said. He never said that she sounded normal. And where did Irby get that the call lasted 20 minutes? In the interview, Tony said the call lasted a few minutes. Does Irby not know what a few means? Or does he just make up things as he goes?
Once in Oak Grove, Tony Jones stated he deposited a check at Regions Bank. Receipt shows 10:51 hours, got a haircut, and went to the bakery barn for lunch. After leaving the bakery barn in Oak Grove, Tony would advise he drove to Forest School to complete work there. At Forest School, Tony Jones engaged in conversation with West Carrol Deputy Zach Crimes, who was working SRO detail. According to Deputy Crimes and Tony Jones, he checked his daughter out of school at approximately 1445 and came to the Sonic in Oak Grove for food. After leaving the Sonic, Tony Jones would advise he and his daughter went across the street from Sonic to the Jones Karate School to prepare for the evening's class. Firearm and National Integrated Ballistic Information Network remain in process at the Shreveport Lab. NLCL, North Louisiana Criminalistics Laboratory, report is not complete.
Well, it's convenient that Tony worked at the school that day, not only so he could pick up his daughter, but also that a deputy would see him there.
Update. On May 22nd, 2023, I received by email a firearms report from the North Louisiana Criminalistics Lab. The report was in reference to matching the spent casing and projectile to the handgun recovered from the shooting scene of redacted address in Oak Grove. Initially, investigators could not locate a spent casing at the scene. Due to the jammed condition of the firearm at the time of recovery, investigators believed the spent casing would be located by the pathologist in the clothing or bed clothing of the victim, which was sent to the pathologist with the victim. The husband, Tony Jones, was not made aware of this. On or about February 15, 2023, investigators learned the pathologist did not locate a spent casing in the victim's clothing or the bed clothing. On February 16, 2023, I received a phone call from Tony Jones. Mr. Jones stated while cleaning the bedroom where his wife was found, he had moved a makeup table and located an empty shell casing that had been lodged underneath some tools his wife used to fix her hair. I went to the residence and recovered what appeared to be a 9mm spent shell casing that investigators did not locate on February 9, 2023. On February 9, 23, while processing the scene, photos were taken of the room. Photo bedroom 3.jpg was taken the day of February 9, 23. In this photo, the reflection of the spent casing can be seen as the casing was hidden from sight beneath the hair tools. After recovery of the spent casing, the firearm, Ruger EC9S spent casing, and the projectile were submitted to the North Louisiana Criminalistics Lab in Shreveport, Louisiana. After a lengthy lab process, it was determined, according to the lab report of May 22, 2023, the spent casing was fired by the Ruger EC9S, and the projectile was also fired by the same EOR.
Irby made sure to note that Tony Jones hadn't been made aware that the shell casing hadn't been found, as to imply that Tony wouldn't have brought in a shell casing unless he'd actually innocently found it. Or maybe he did know that the shell casing hadn't been found. I don't know how it wasn't found during the investigation of the bedroom. Oh, wait, yes I do. It wasn't found because there wasn't a proper search of the bedroom done. The dog could have eaten the shell casing while Irby was taking blurry pictures of pill bottles. I'm so glad that the bottle of Febreze is in focus, though. Here is the bedroom 3 pic from the crime scene photos that he mentioned. That is not a reflection of a shell casing. That is a reflection of something on the straightener or the makeup brush. Here's a lightened version of the photo. No shell casing. Overall, the crime scene photos are just so poorly done. Some are blurry. There's a photo inside of a trash can, and I have no idea why that pic was taken. And this might look like a photo of a blurry, moldy M&M, but it's actually a photo of the bullet they dug out of the wall. Overall, the crime scene photos were a joke, as was the so-called investigation. Even if it had been a suicide, how deputies treated the crime scene was a disservice and a disgrace to Crystal, her family, and everyone who loved her. Even after being presented with all of the discrepancies in Tony's timeline, even with evidence that Google Timeline was showing something different than what Tony told them, the sheriff's department didn't make any effort to actually investigate. If Crystal's case is ever reopened and investigated, I sincerely hope it's not left to the West Carroll Parish Sheriff's Department to do it, because I'm not sure they could find their own backsides with both hands. In the next video in this series, we'll talk about Tony Jones's actions before and after Crystal's death. Crystal's sister Jana has a Facebook group, Justice for Crystal McCrory Jones, and has written a book about the case. There is a petition on change.org to have Crystal's case reopened, and I'll leave links for all of those in the description box. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe as this helps my channel grow. Until next time, stay safe and be happy.